If you pay attention during the opening scene, you can see that Tsubasa is holding a pink-colored box with her. It's not mentioned in this episode, but this scene happened on February 14th, or Valentine's Day to be precise, and that's why you can still see snow on the road. The pink-colored box that Tsubasa has is undoubtedly Valentine chocolate, and that's why this scene feels so tragic, because the contrast between love and despair is really unexpected from a cute girl called Tsubasa Nanase. Honestly, Tsubasa's past is probably the darkest scene we have so far in Classroom Elite, and to put this in the opening, our expectation for the uninhabited island exam has skyrocketed once again. It's kind of disappointing that they didn't include how Tsukishiro stirred up Tsubasa in that scene, because that could simply tell you why Tsubasa attends the school and why she's targeting Ayanokoji, but overall this opening scene really amplified the story from the light novel. They also add a little detail about how Tsubasa pronounces herself while talking about her old self, and you better pay attention to that because it will be important later. With the opening scene this good, I'm really glad that the overall episode has shown a lot of improvement compared to the previous four. Starting from the rules explanation, it's quite a surprise they decide to adapt those scenes even if not complete, because the previous two exams only show the rules by the wall of text. The explanation is still not as good as the previous season, but this is still a really good improvement. This episode adapts a nice 25% of the material from Volume 3 second year arc, and it resulted in a nice pacing even with a little skip content. This episode skipped both Hirata's and Kiryuin's conversations with Ayanokoji, but since both conversations are not really important, it doesn't seem their inexistence makes any difference for this episode. On the contrary, they adapt a nice funny moment between Ayanokoji and Ibuki. Any interaction between Ibuki and Ayanokoji is honestly golden, and if you are reading the light novel, you will find this scene funnier because for some cursed reason, both Ayanokoji and Ibuki always find themselves trapped in unexplainable situations. Since all those scenes from the first year were never adapted into the anime, this episode is probably our last time seeing them that close. Speaking of Ibuki, this particular scene with her and Horikita just made me laugh for no reason. That part never happened in the light novel, and since it's a close-up frame, I don't understand why the studio feels it's necessary for Ibuki to do something like that, and why both Horikita and Ayanokoji didn't make any comment about it. It does come to my attention that the new art style and clothing choice made the female characters' breasts more prominent. But for Ibuki, who usually never touches and hates being touched, this scene is straight up a bait for anyone who likes to ship them together. Not that I complain, this scene is fun even if it's weird. And now let's talk about how this episode feels significantly better compared to the previous four episodes. I have two main criticisms about the previous four episodes, which are the content that feels all over the place, and the lack sense of time. Believe it or not, Episode 5 to Episode 8 actually lasted around 2.5 months in their time, but since we never really get the time pointed out, it just feels weird that a month suddenly passed by. In this episode, not only do we return the focus to Ayanokoji, but now we've got a simple note whenever the day has passed or if Ayanokoji moves to a certain area. This note will be very useful just in case you want to track Ayanokoji's movement, or if you have the island map in your hand, you can see what kind of environment Ayanokoji is currently facing. The rules explanation is not perfect, but at least this episode shows us how the students are experiencing the exam through their actions. For example, we always see Ayanokoji and the others holding their tablets, because from the tablet, you can see your next designation target or your total amount of points, and it emphasizes how important this gadget is on this exam. The wristwatch is also designed with quite a detail that lets us see different kinds of data from the wearer. This is also not mentioned in this episode, but this wristwatch is different compared to what they wear in the first island exam. This is an upgraded version that could send an emergency alarm and even have a monitor, but since it's a bit bigger and has more functions, this wristwatch is easier to break. Just like what I said before, this episode fixes a lot of problems with the previous episodes. They explain the rules better, the pacing is nice and steady, and if you have a problem with how the previous episodes look too bright or white, this episode has way better lighting, maybe because most of the scenes are under the shadow. However, since this is still the first episode of the island exam, we have not yet seen a lot of characters and their actions, so it's better to enjoy this story focused on Ayanokoji before more and more characters start to show up. Needless to say, this episode is definitely Tsubasa's episode despite half of it being the introduction of the island. Now that we know she has a connection with Tsukishiro, it's just natural that all her movements start to look suspicious. Without spoiling too much, it's probably better if you start paying attention to everything that Tsubasa did. Her asking to follow Ayanokoji is definitely suspicious, but the way she always approaches him is actually the early stage of their whole strategy to expel Ayanokoji. Honestly, there are a lot of things that need to be noted from this episode that I am glad not getting skipped. For example, Tsukishiro's speech about the incident is an indirect threat toward Ayanokoji. And how Ayanokoji thinks about it on the first night on the island at least tells us that Ayanokoji already predicts all kinds of methods that Tsukishiro would probably use. It's also nice to see both Mishima and Hoshinomiya don't seem comfortable with Tsukishiro talking about the possibility of calling the cops, because that told us that Tsukishiro's method is kind of extreme by the usual school standard. It's already hinted at in the previous episode, but Tsukishiro's time as acting chairman is almost over, so the uninhabited island exam is his last effort to expel Ayanokoji. That's why this uninhabited island exam is way bigger and even dangerous compared to all the exams so far, because Tsukishiro already has nothing to lose and nobody could control him. It's true that the first episode doesn't really look like it will be so big and dangerous, but this is still an introduction episode, and we still have another 7 episodes to reach the climax of the uninhabited island exam. That's why if you think this episode feels so relaxed and doesn't really look like an actual exam, you really need to wait until the stakes become so much bigger in the second half. Overall, this episode continues the solid adaptation from the previous episode. Nothing seems really memorable other than Tsubasa's flashback, but it's still a solid adaptation with only a few things that could be criticized. For a note, another problem that often occurred in Classroom Elite adaptation ever since the first season is too much skip content, but just like the other problems, this problem is almost nowhere to be seen in Season 4, especially in this episode. Having to adapt the total of 4 volumes into 16 episodes seems to prove that this number is a good ratio for Classroom Elite anime adaptation. As a result, we got to enjoy a few funny scenes that normally wouldn't have made it into the adaptation in the previous season. We have 2 scenes that show us how funny and simple-minded Ishizaki is, and how his teammates cannot follow his high spirit. We rarely got to know Ishizaki outside of Ryuen's influence on him, so these scenes are nice to show us that some people like Ishizaki exist in the middle of a very serious and dangerous exam. The only other character that seems as fearless as him is just Ibuki, so you probably understand why Ryuen decided to use 20 million and bring Katsuragi instead of forming a group with them. For the last, I think Horikita wearing a hat is quite a nice addition in this episode. Even though it's not light novel accurate, since Horikita probably worries about her health, she chose to become the only student who wears such a fancy hat on the uninhabited island. For a note, students could buy that kind of hat with their starting point on the cruise ship, but they also need to buy a tent and food with that starting point, so there should not be too much point left for luxury.